Well, welcome to another episode of Piping Up. Today we are at Trinity Lutheran Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Behind us is the massive MP Möller organ, and let me here is Robert Horton. He's been tuning this organ for several years and keeping up with this organ. So tell us a little bit about the history of the organ and what you do to keep it maintained.
You've got a long story, so settle in for a bit of a tale. The congregation dates to 1730. Those are the earliest baptismal records we have. They had a smaller building just across the street with an organ by Gottlob Klemm, dating from the 1740s. They built a new building, this structure that we're in the 1760s. They brought their old Klemm organ in here, and that worked for a couple of years. But in 1772, they commissioned David Tannenberg, a Moravian builder just up the road in Lititz, to construct a new instrument, and you see parts of the case of that instrument behind that. David Tannenberg finished that instrument in 1774. The casework was built by Peter Frick, a cabinet maker in Germantown, and David Tannenberg did the instrument inside. That instrument served up until the 1850s. In the 1850s, they gutted and renovated this sanctuary basically down to the bare walls and subfloor. The altar used to be over there. They moved it over there. They basically rotated the axis of the sanctuary 90 degrees. And as a part of that process, they engaged Henry Knauff in the 1850s to rebuild the Tannenberg organ. He used a fair bit of Tannenberg's materials, kept the casework. The Knauff organ served until the 1880s when it was replaced by Roosevelt out of New York. Roosevelt got himself into a bit of a problem with the instrument. A lot of times here in the United States, people want more, and Roosevelt crammed so much new organ into the old Tannenberg case that it had egress problems. So that organ was installed in 1886, but it had to be taken completely apart and rebuilt in the 1890s by Bernard Mudler, working out of Philadelphia. And if you look at the historic casework behind me and you count in from the sides 8 pipes, you can see that those are extensions that were added on. Bernard Mudler took the Roosevelt organ apart, expanded the case outward a little bit, and that allowed him enough space inside there to rearrange the Roosevelt parts such that the organ could get its sound out into the room. That stayed until a renovation of the church in the 1920s. The instrument was rebuilt by Casavant and finished in 1923 under the direction of Corboin, who was the organist of the Wanamaker department store at the time. That Casavant organ served more or less reliably for a couple of years, but by the 1950s it was already having problems. The entire instrument was replaced by the Möller Company in 1962. At that time they added the exposed pipework divisions, what we call in the trade flower pots, on either side of the instrument. That dates to 1962. And the instrument was also updated throughout the years 1970s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s by a gentleman named Jim McFarlane, who ran a small organ building and service and concern over in Marietta.
So I guess with the change, when Roosevelt did his stuff, I guess probably the church was not exactly pleased to have to redo it over again because of that.
I wasn't there at the time, but if I'd been the musician, you sure would have heard from me.
Yeah, for sure. Now it's interesting, the front of the organ, the facade there, that is non-speaking pipes, correct?
It is non-speaking now. So David Tannenberg, dating to 1774, comes from a curious part of the old country and practiced a very unique style of pipe construction. If you're familiar with what a languid is, it's a little horizontal piece of metal that separates the foot from the body. David Tannenberg's languids are very unique. They're really good for producing a very sweet lyrical singing sound, but they don't give you as much in the way of flexibility for what you can do as a voicer. With a more standard languid construction, if you want the organ pipe to do this, you can push it this way. If you want the organ pipe to do this, you can push it that way. With Tannenberg's languids, they do one thing and they're really happy with it, but if you try to push them outside of that envelope, they just stop speaking altogether. So what happened for the renovation in the 1850s, when they reoriented the sanctuary, the acoustics in the sanctuary took a bit of a hit, which meant that Tannenberg's pipes, having been voiced for what the sanctuary was before the renovation, no longer had enough power to fill the sanctuary. And Knauff comes in, he tries to use them, he tries to push them. If you look behind them, you can see they've been laddered out quite a bit. So Knauff was trying to push the scale, where you take all of the pipes and then just shift them one note, so you get a fatter scale and then you cut them shorter. And they stop speaking on them, period. The bigger 8-foot pipes that you see in the larger towers, you can see he tried adding ears. That didn't help him. He got himself into a pickle and eventually said, look, I'm not going to be able to use these pipes. I'll just put a newer principal stop inside the case. And ever since then, 1853, those pipes have been decorative dummies.
And they do look quite nice, and they definitely are a
If you're up
festive
for a
piece in the room.
climb, you can go up there and just stick your mouth on the toe board and give him a toot. He did not get to the 4-foot pipes up in what the Germans would call the Oberwerk division. So those pipes are pretty much untouched. They're original to what they were in the 1770s. They sound delightful.
Right, and for this organ, you had added a stop on this organ that you had built yourself, as well as you had changed how it sounded. So what was the change that you did with that, and why?
Okay, there's ballpark about 70 or 80 pipes in this instrument that came out of my basement, and a lot of that was I had nothing better to do with myself during lockdown. So on this side, as you're looking at the organ, you can see 12 wood-fronted pipes with cherry fronts. So that is a new 4-foot bottom octave for the 4-foot flute. There's a similar set down in the choir to create a 2-foot flute, and then there's also a tenor C principal in the swell division. The answer is, I had time on my hands, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. As far as changing the instrument's sound, the most distinctive one is that the instrument is currently tuned in 1/6 syntonic comma mean tone, which is a mouthful indeed. This is the question of temperament, and as you get into the weeds for tuning, there's 3 things. So number 1, there's the pitch level. When you hear people talking about A is 440 or A is 415, there's the absolute pitch level of 1 pitch. That's number 1. Number 3 is tuning all of the octaves and unisons so that everything is related to that. But number 2 is the interesting one. That's in the middle, what the British refer to as laying the bearings. So once you've established the absolute pitch for A, then you have to decide on the relationship for the other 11 notes of the chromatic scale. How do they relate to the A? How do they harmonize with it? Mathematically, you can't have all of them harmonized perfectly. So the question is, what do you do about that? With this instrument, 1/6 syntonic comma mean tone, what we've decided to do is put all of our eggs into one basket and go for the maximum possible beauty, the richest, most harmonious sound we can possibly get for some intervals, at a cost of, you'll hear there are some intervals that do sound rather discordant in there. So why would you do such a thing? The short and ruthlessly provocative answer is because it sounds better. That richness and that harmonious beauty that you gain for 8 out of the 12 keys is worth the price that you pay for the somewhat discordant sound that you get out of the other 4 keys.
Now, because obviously this is, as you said, it's definitely sounds a lot more beautiful, but I guess there's other options as well, say like Fisk 2.
There are.
Yeah, so what overall decided, like who came up with the, I guess I'm assuming you came up with the idea, but how was your decision made to go, instead of being like, oh, let's do Fisk 2, I guess you just went with what you went with because what you had available for the organ, I guess.
Whole range. So put major thirds on one side, put perfect fifths on the other side. You've got a balancing beam and you got to pick something.
Right.
If you favor your perfect fifths to the expense of all else, you end up with a temperament called Pythagorean temperament, named for Pythagoras. If you favor your major thirds to the expense of everything else, you end up with 1/4 syntonic comma mean tone. Just, a fly's wing in this way from your perfect fifths is equal temperament. Okay? Equal temperament gives you perfect fifths that are almost dead on pure, and your major thirds sound horrific. Come in just a little bit this way, you have 1/6 syntonic comma mean tone. So your thirds are not as perfect as they are in quarter comma. Your fifths are not as bad as they are in quarter comma. The other thing about sixth comma is that it was probably practiced out in the old country. So as we were contemplating the history of this instrument, what might it have sounded? There's part of me that says it's possible David Tannenberg was working with 1/6 syntonic comma mean tone. That's something he would have brought over from the old country. That's something his teacher, Gottlob Klemm, would have brought over from the old country. And so the question becomes, could you even do such a thing today? So the conventional wisdom for the late 20th and into the early 21st century at this point for American organists is that's all interesting, fine, and dandy for an academic context, but for church on Sunday morning, you absolutely have to have equal temperament, otherwise, I don't know, Jesus doesn't love you or something. Me being the ornery, cantankerous guy that I am, I said, okay, well, let's find out. So I made the pastor a deal. I said, for historic interests, for what this might have sounded like with David Tannenberg, and for practical interest to see, can this serve a 21st century congregation, let's try putting the organ in 6 comma. I told the pastor, just keep the boss informed, and a couple of other folks in the choir, but by and large, I didn't tell folks what we were doing here. We just went for it. And lo and behold, the instrument just sounds so rich and beautiful that everyone loved it.
Yeah.
And we didn't really need to make a big fuss out of it at all. You asked about Fisk too, you asked about other ones. So we put mean tone over here, we put equal temperament over here. As you start working your way through all of these guys over here, there's a whole range of different what are called well temperaments.
Right.
And that's fertile ground for study. I can highly recommend Pierre-Yves Vaslin's book, Musique et Temperament. I'm pretty sure it's out in an English edition as well, where he goes through all of the different temperament options that you have in there. And that gets me to the one last nice thing about 6th comma, is that 6th comma, you can think of it sort of as a mother temperament, in that there's a whole bunch of little daughter temperaments that can come off of 6th comma without having to retemper the entire instrument. So when we did this, we didn't want to do anything that would be overly destructive. We didn't want to do anything that would require us to cut down the pipes terribly short. We wanted to be as low impact and make it reversible, because the condition to getting permission to do this was that if it really turned out to fly like a lead balloon, I was going to pay out of my own pocket to put the organ back.
Fix it. Yeah.
I was wagering. It turned out really well. 6th comma can be changed into Brombaug's mild, it can be changed into Young, it can be changed into Volati, it can be changed into James Lowder's Houghton temperament, it can be changed into Neihart's small city temperament that Richard Fuchs uses. It's a temperament where you start with 6 comma mean tone, but if you just tweak 2 notes on the far side of the circle of fifths, boom, you've got a new well temperament. If you just move 1 note over here and do this, you've got a new well temperament. So you can change it really easily without having to go through and reset every set of the bearings.
Makes sense. right, next to me is Chris Prestia. He is the current organist at Trinity Lutheran. So it was really nice to hear you play today. And tell us a little bit about you here playing the organ and just...
Yeah. So I'm fairly new here, which is actually why I really appreciate Rob Horton being a part of this, because he knows the history much better, and I'm the new guy. But speaking of the temperaments, I've been really enjoying that sixth comma mean tone. It's everything he said is exactly right. It's very sweet, and it's perfectly usable for romantic music. Some things don't work well, but they're not things I like playing anyway, so I'm quite fine with it.
So, for you, where did you play the organ prior to here?
Oh yeah, I've had a number of local church jobs. Variety of instruments. One was a 2-manual tracker, another is a 3-manual electro-pneumatic with Walker Digital. Before that, I had a really fun 2-manual tracker. So it's kind of a variety of things.
When did you start playing the organ?
That's a fun little story. So when I was 15 years old, I should say for my 15th birthday, I don't really get into gifts. So when my mom asks me, what do I want for my birthday? I said, for my birthday, I want to play a real pipe organ. And she goes, oh my gosh. So we lived at that time in Sussex County, New Jersey. And it's very rural.
Yeah.
And she just went into the phone book and started calling all the churches down the list like, hi, my son is turning 15. He wants to play a pipe organ. Do you guys have a pipe organ? And can you let him play it? So God bless her. And she came across a church, Newton Presbyterian Church. At the time, John Barada was the organist, and he ended up being my first organ teacher. So that's how I got started. At that time, I did have a small church job as a pianist, and then I switched over to organ.
And when did you officially start your job as a pianist? What age?
I was 14, I think.
Oh, okay.
Well, it was a job. I was playing in the service, but we had an agreement that they wouldn't pay me right away because I was just so bad, and I was the only one that applied. And when you're learning piano as a piano student, to play a hymn out of a hymnal is really hard.
Right.
So it was like melody in the right hand, maybe the bass line, and I was messing things up. And they're like, just take your time, get used to it. We're happy. They were so supportive.
Yeah.
And eventually, I started getting $50 a week, and that was the biggest deal in the world for me. It's tremendous.
Yeah. So, what's your favorite thing about playing just this organ, or just any organ that you've played in previous years?
Yeah, I'll answer that generally. The organ as the instrument, what drew me to the organ initially was the sustained sound. Every other instrument, you have to be with an ensemble and stagger breathe to get this sort of sustained sound that an organ can do, or with strings, stagger bow. But I love that you can just get a carpet of sound, you can get a wall of sound, you can make a cushion of sound, and no other instrument can really do that. So that initially got me interested. Now what I like most about playing the organ is the challenge that comes from making expressive, organic sounding art out of a very complicated machine. In many ways, being an organist is a lot more like being a conductor, because this is maybe the only instrument where you are not the power source. You are, every other instrument, you're blowing into it, you're making the sound, you're bowing the string. But here, I'm just telling the device when to release air into pipes. And each individual pipe can only play, of course, one note at one volume and in one timbre. So it's kind of like having a giant orchestra of hundreds of lousy musicians who can only each do one thing. And it's my job to control them so precisely that it sounds like something expressive. In a way, it's like illusion. It's like magician sort of.
So, what advice would you have for anyone that's looking to learn the organ and play the organ? What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, so I'm actually a teacher myself, and one of my specialties is practice technique. So I will give a piece of practice advice for new organists. When the challenge of the organ, the thing that makes distinguishes learning organ from everything else is the coordination. So left hand, right hand, feet all together at the same time. And I see a lot of young organists and beginner organists of all ages, they work on hands separately and feet separate, which is great, but they do that for too long. They wait too long before putting all of the limbs together. As soon as you're able to comfortably do hands and feet separate, start putting them together. If it's overwhelming, then just do one measure or two beats, half a measure, one beat.
Take a step back a little bit.
But keep it all together, because if you're not practicing coordinating everything, you're not really learning the meat and potatoes of what it is to be an organist.
Yeah, because I think, at least for me, for memory, I'm able to kind of remember where I am in positions. So I think pedal for me kind of comes more or less easy. It used to be,
Awesome.
I had to look. Now it's not as bad. I look once in a while, and I think all organists do, just to make sure they're on the right track.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it is noticeably easier for sure. Though I will say, I think for many people that are concerned about playing the organ, I think what really bothers them the most is there's a lot that happens at once between, like you said, both hands, the feet on the pedals, what registration, what do you use, what manual is played, that I think really, especially the bigger you get, I think really bothers people to the point. And I think, you have to work with people very cautiously to eventually kind of build their confidence in that stuff.
Yeah, and in other instruments, like violin, there's also a lot to do at once, worrying about the bow and the fingers. But on violin, it's so much more obvious to put it all together.
Right.
And so when I teach a string lesson, it's the opposite problem. String players like to put too much together at once, and I'm saying, no, just practice open strings, just your right hand, just your left. And then organists, it's the opposite, like, no, put it together, you've got to put it together. Because it's easier to separate your hands on a keyboard than it is with another instrument.
So we're inside the organ, and I feel obligated to offer a bit of a disclaimer and a warning first, and that is that if you all find this really interesting, that's great. Make sure you talk to your organ technician first. We love questions. We love the enthusiasm, but make sure you talk to your technician first before you go inside an organ and start knocking things around. Mm-hmm. So you wanted a quick demonstration of tuning. Right here we've got a whole selection of what are called labial pipes, one of two families. Labial pipes, not to be confused with reed pipes, such as this oboe that's right in front of you here. These guys are tuned using sleeves, and the sleeve goes up to make the pipe flatter. The sleeve comes down to make the pipe sharper. So I'll have our assistant go ahead and play. Hey, Chris, can you go ahead and hit tenor C on the swell octavan? So that's that pipe right there. Okay, play low C with it. So he's playing this pipe and that pipe. It's an octave, and all I need to do... Stop for a second. So you can see that if I shade the top of the pipe with my iron, then that will cause it to go flat. That also helps me confirm that I'm on the correct pipe. So go ahead, play the two of them. So now it's flat. You can hear it's beating. Okay, so that's dead on. Keep playing it. If I go too far, you can see it's beating once again. So now we'll take it back. There you go. Sleeve tuning such as this was favored by factory builders. So all of your Möllers, your Skinners, your Austins, your Wicks, big factories that are cranking out 100 organs a year. It has a lower initial investment in terms of skill. It does require more maintenance over the life of the instrument, although if you're a factory that's chunking these things out, you're trying to save a little bit on labor. The other system is what's called cone tuning, and that's where you would use a big heavy iron with either a cone or a tip on one end, and you can flare the top of the pipe inside or outside. Mm-hmm. This has advantages that it tends to sound better. It gives you a bigger window as far as how beautiful a tone you can get out of the pipes. It's more stable long term, but it does require a bigger initial investment in terms of skill and competence for the people who do it. These guys here, it sets a bit of a ceiling as far as the absolute beauty and quality that you can get out of the tone, but it does have a much lower threshold of entry as far as what kind of folks can work on this, mm-hmm. Sort of the caliber of staff that you need. And there you have it. We have tuned a pipe. Do that another 2,000 times and you've got a whole organ done. Mm-hmm. Okay. So over the years, one of the things that they wanted to do, 1962, this instrument was built with a sifflote and a larigot in the positive division, really high-pitched stops that were just as squeaky and shrill as you could possibly imagine. So they stole some pipes out of here. We're down here in the choir division, and used them to shift those ranks. So they turned the 1 foot and the 1 1/3 into a tierce and a zard by stealing pipes from down here. So you can see there's 12 wood pipes down here. They had just left this 2 foot shifted down to become a 1 foot down here. So I shifted them back and then made a couple of replacement pipes just to fill in what they had stolen to put over there. The other thing, this used to have a crumhorn here. That crumhorn is now out in a much more favorable position on the exposed positive division on the right side of the organ. And since we had an extra toe board here, there was an old Austin Vox Humana that they had kicking around back in the tower. It played off the swell division, but it was not even audible out in the church because it was so far back into the rest of the stonework of the building. So crumhorn leaves this one, and then I made an overlay and a couple of new boots for the old Austin Vox, and that sits here down in the choir division, and it sounds considerably better.
And that was the same issue with the chimes back here. It's not very audible.
Right. We're down here in the basement of the old Tannenberg case. This division really struggles to get its sound out into the room. So it was definitely a step up for the Vox. If you move this somewhere else, it'd probably be even better still. The chimes ditto. They really don't have much of an impact out in the room.
Yeah. Now, I guess, is there an option, I guess, to eventually, well, yeah, I guess move them eventually at some point? I guess it'd just be the question of
I don't
where.
work here anymore, so you'd have to talk to the guy in charge.
Right, yeah. Yep,
Not my organ anymore.
yep. But still, excellent job with moving things where they are now.
So we're inside the case. Up at the top, this would have been the 4-foot principle of the Oberwerk division in a traditional German organ of the 18th century here. You can see the conveyance holes here. What's interesting about this is that near as we can tell, these pipes have not been altered at all. They are not currently used. The reason they're not used is that in the 1850s, when Knauff was rebuilding the organ, he tried to push the 8-foot rank down there as the main principle, and he got so frustrated working with David Tannenberg's pipes that he gave up on them, and by the time he got up here, he had already resigned himself to the fact that this would just be a non-speaking dummy facade. So this really is as close as we can get to the original sound, and if you find, I think it's this one right here, so you can get your mouth dirty and get a mouthful of dust. But that's pretty much how the original principle would have sounded.
Yeah, I guess for the whole case, when they did some work on this, I guess you said they left it as is, so it hasn't really been touched ever since.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. You see these cornices here, those were chopped off for the Kasavant in the 1920s. But all of that molding, those would definitely have returned all the way to the wall behind you. And right now it's all just sort of propped up from behind, kind of like a Hollywood set piece.
Yeah, because I think, especially the one over here on the side, I think you can kind of notice it a little bit out from the front. You can notice it's kind of cut. Yeah.